On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World Season 2. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our first session of the day is the Fire Starters, Jan Carson in conversation with Jayanti Naju Seth. Belfast-based writer Jan Carson won accolades including the European Union Prize for Literature Ireland for her novel The Fire Starters. Her work is marked by the caustic wit and lyrical style. The Fire Starters is a mediation on identity, culture, and fatherhood, which weaves through the fluid lines between fantasy and truth and ideas of right and wrong. Carson's other work includes books such as Postcard Stories, Children's Children, and Malcolm Orange Disappears. In a conversation with academic Jayanti Naju Seth, Carson explores her writing practice, Irish literature, and her deep interest in Agatha Christie. Jan Carson has a novel, Malcolm Orange Disappears, and a short story collection, Children's Children, and two microfiction collections, Postcard Stories 1 and 2. Her novel, The Fire Starters, won the European Union Prize for Literature in 2019 and was shortlisted for the BBC National Story Prize 2020. Jayanti Naju Seth recently retired as head of the Department of English at the Jesus and Mary College, New Delhi. She has edited and published two collections of essays on Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice and on Marquez's Chronicles of a Death Foretold, respectively. All our sessions, remember, that have been broadcast are available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to ask questions and comment by typing it into the comment section below, and Jayanti will promise that she will ask these of Jan. She really needs to feel now that she's back in the saddle in a place that she knows best, which is English literature. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, remember you can find us on Facebook and YouTube. And also in case we drop off, just hang in there and we'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, the Fire Starters, Jan Carson in conversation with Jayanti Naju Seth. Jan, Jayanti, over to both of you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Well, welcome, Jan Carson. Welcome indeed. It's an honor to have you join us here on the virtual version of the Jaipur Literary Festival. Let me start by confessing that it was with some trepidation that I read your piece on the 10 ways to make a writer feel uncomfortable at a book festival. So perhaps then I thought, perhaps it is in everyone's best interest that we are doing this via the internet, and you are in your home and I am in mine. As Sanjay has listed your achievements in writing and your publications, I'll just run through them to give our audience, who perhaps won't be so certain of the dates of these. I find that your writing has been prolific and rapid, and I wanted to date your publications. So in 2014, you came out with Malcolm Orange Disappears, which, as you have said somewhere, is actually not your first, but your second novel, because the first one you did not see through to publication. In fact, you binned it. In 2016, which was just a gap of 2 years, you came out with a collection of short stories called Children's Children. 2017, there is the genre of flash fiction in the Postcard Stories. And in 2019, The Fire Starters, which won the very prestigious European Union Prize for Literature in the year 2019. So that's a lot of writing in a very, very short period of time.
Yeah. Kind of exhausting to hear all of that.
Yeah, it gives the full picture, doesn't it, of exactly what you have been very busy with. So we're really here to talk about The Fire Starters, an incredible novel in which you have a portrait of Belfast, a portrait that really implies that the Troubles never really finished, that there is a legacy left behind of the Troubles, which is indelibly a part of life in Belfast. if I can just stray into autobiography for a minute, I was studying at Trinity College in Dublin in the 70s and was specifically asked by friends who came to study at Trinity from Enniskillen and from Belfast itself to not visit home, to not go home with them when they visited, not because they were unfriendly, but because it was such a dangerous place or considered so at the time. It's sad, but it's, you would have your finger on the pulse. It's probably very true that the troubles are still there in another form, perhaps slightly less visible. I wanted to start, Jan, by asking you, do you think that this non-realist form that you have used of the surreal genre of magic realism is the best way to portray the complexity of the ongoing situation in Northern Ireland now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if I would say it's the best way. I do think it is one way, and I think it's a way which hasn't been explored terribly well in the canon of Northern Irish literature. So I guess sometimes people think that serious times like the Troubles and the conflict in Northern Ireland requires a very serious, straightforward, approach to writing. And so a lot of the literature that's come out of Northern Ireland in the last 50 years has been very linear, very realist. And yet we work against the backdrop of the bigger Irish world of literature, where you have lots of absurdist writers and, people like Beckett and Flann O'Brien, and who were really comfortable with playing around with the lines of realism. And I also write against the background of, I know Marquez was mentioned there in your introduction, but the big magic realists like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Günter Grass, Salman Rushdie, who have used that kind of playful take on realism to engage with big political issues and cultural issues. And so it's always kind of shocked me that there isn't more of that writing in Northern Ireland. We have a huge oral tradition here. We have a deep and grounding in religion, obviously. There are lots of myths and legends going around, and yet what we tend to write is this realist fiction all the time.
Right. And you have chosen the other path to portray.
Yeah, yes. I haven't even chosen it, Jayanti. It's a funny thing because people always ask, why have you chosen to write magic realism? I didn't even know I was a magic realist. I just wrote the way I wanted to write. And it was about 7 or 8 years ago, the Northern Irish poet Sinead Morrissey gave me a copy of The Tin Drum by Günter Grass and said, that's what you are. You're a magic realist.
Yeah.
So that kind of style just came naturally to me without even knowing what I was doing.
Wow. Okay, that really is very interesting. If we could turn to some of the specifics in this novel, in the Firestarters, I'd like to start with the Bonfires. They're fascinating. They're absolutely riveting, the way that it's described. 30 foot high or higher. I have 2 or 3 questions. I'll ask them all in a kind of a package. Are they a reality in Belfast? And also, following hard on the heels of that, given that they are so dangerous, both in the ability to, set things on fire, which are not intended to be on fire, as well as the violence which they engender simply by being there and because of the, of the political content of them, why have they never been banned altogether? And I'm going to ask you to, at the same time, carry on to tell me whether in your novel, I'm asking, are they real? Do they still go on, these 30-foot fires? Are you using them metaphorically? Are you using them also metaphorically, but they are a reality? It didn't escape my attention. I don't think it will have escaped the attention of many of your careful readers, that you brought in very subtly and in passing the Twin Towers, and that has to be the tallest fire of all, perhaps engendered through similar passions of feeling helpless, feeling rage, which these bonfires do. In which case, are we speaking about a reality of these fires, or are we speaking about something that is really more than that underlies that?
Okay, what I'll maybe do, in case there are any listeners who don't know what the bonfires are in Belfast, is I'll give you a little quick potted history of them. So on the 12th of July every year, we have what's called Orange Parades, and it's a group of people, the Orange Order, who are Protestant background, and they want to celebrate their culture, and they're celebrating a battle that happened in 1690 where William of Orange fought and supposedly defended Ireland from the Catholics, and so we have the Orange Men marching on the 12th of July every year. Huge, biggest cultural event in Northern Ireland until very recently it was taken over by the Pride parades, which is great. On the 11th night, on the 11th of July, they light bonfires all over the country. So the people who will go to the parade next day go to the bonfires on the evening before. And the bonfires are built over a period of around anything. They can begin collecting firewood at the end of May sometimes. So by the time we get to the 11th of July, these structures can be anything up to 60 or 70 foot tall. They're an incredible, colossal piece of architecture to see going up because they're built by amateurs in the streets, and they can be in urban environments. I grew up in the country, so the bonfires we went to as children were in fields. They were very rural. Oh. And the bonfires symbolise the little bonfires that were lit by William of Orange's followers to show the way to the battleground. So they're reenacting a piece of Protestant history and culture. They are very real. There was one at the end of my street in the 11th night just back this summer. They're definitely not metaphorical. You can feel the heat off them. They're very real. And you know, as your question began at the start about is the Troubles over or are the Troubles not over? Yeah. Bonfires have become a really contentious issue in this conversation because they're a symbol of Protestant culture. They represent something of our history and our traditions, and the idea that they would be restricted has become a kind of battleground for other bigger questions about Protestant identity and how we're viewed by Dublin, how we're viewed by Westminster. So they've become a kind of political football. There have been attempts to make them smaller and safer, but to be honest, quite often the police are terrified to enforce those restrictions because they will be threatened. That's the bottom line of bonfire culture in Northern Ireland. I was fascinated by them, like I'm fascinated by a lot of the symbols of what we call unionist political Protestant culture in Northern Ireland because they're larger than life. And when you look at these enormous bonfires at the end of the street, when you see the images painted on the gable walls of the houses here with the red hand of Ulster or King Billy on his big white horse, they're larger than life. There is a very thin line between realism and tipping into the fantastical. And for me as a magic realist writer, that's a very rich area to work in. And so a lot of the symbols that are exploited in the fire starters are symbols of unionist culture that I was intrigued by, and I wanted to see if I could draw out something a bit larger than life. That's a kind of tiny potted history of bonfires. I could talk about them for about hours and hours and hours and hours, but I hope that gives folks a wee understanding of what they're like.
I do have a quick question. What are the materials that go into the combustible materials that go into the building of these bonfires? And the height. You said that they represent the small bonfires that were lit when King Billy was going. When did they start climbing in height to these enormous...
They started climbing in height, to be very honest, at the same time as the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So the Good Friday Peace Agreement was signed in 1998. And a lot of the Protestant community felt that all the concessions were made on their side. So the RUC, which was our police force, which had been predominantly Protestant, became much more balanced. There were lots of regulations put in place on Protestant culture to make things more balanced and fair. But they felt that a lot of the concessions had been made by them. And so some of these symbols, like the bonfires, like marching, they became battlegrounds where they felt they were fighting to hold on to what was left of their identity. So it's why you will find a huge emphasis on things like flags. That the Protestants want to fly the Union Jack everywhere, and it's symbolic. You know, they feel like if the flag goes, what will go next, and how will we be left? Will we be just a homogenous kind of country with no distinct cultural identities, or, you know, can we still be Protestants because we don't want to sacrifice our symbols? In terms of the material that goes in, there's been a lot of legislation put in place around making them more environmentally friendly. When I was a kid, it was tires and the pollution was terrible. It's now mostly pallets, you know, the kind of pallets that you would get in factories. And,
Yes.
and so they start going around the different warehouses and things in May to collect them. You'll see lots of little boys out with 2 skateboards and maybe 15 or 20 pallets pushing them down the road to get them to the bonfire site. It's a real cultural thing to witness. And I have to say, like, the architecture, the building that goes into it, they're fantastic.
To attain this height, yes, I would imagine that.
Yeah.
Okay, and you say that the government does not want to ban them because they don't want to take this on. Am I right in understanding?
I wouldn't say that the government doesn't want to ban them. I'm sure they probably could see them far enough, but they are sensible enough to know that to try and get rid of them altogether would cause a huge problem. And so what is often the case is they're offered grants from the government if they will keep their bonfires to a minimum height, if they will celebrate in a way that's not threatening to the community around them. So the government will then give them a grant to have a street party. So, you know, you can make it family friendly. And with those bonfires, they're wonderful. They're actually, you know, you go to them, you don't feel threatened. There are children there. You know, it doesn't feel out of control. And in that case, I think, why shouldn't people be allowed to celebrate their traditions and their culture if they're doing it in a respectful way?
So in that case, would you think that it's too far-fetched to say that the 9/11 attacks and the Twin Towers going down seemed to me to be an extension of the bonfire, the tall fires, as you call them? Tall fires.
I honestly wasn't thinking about that at all, because the tall fires in my head have always been these bonfires. You know, my house is 10 houses away from a 70-foot bonfire, so I know exactly what a tall fire is.
Right. I'm speaking as a complete outsider, of course, here. Okay, so before we discuss the more specifics on the book, could I ask you, Jan, if you would read a passage from the book?
Yeah. I'm just going to read the opening section because it covers a lot of kind of these things.
Yes, yes.
So it's about 2 pages.
Yes.
And I'll just go for it.
Thank you.
This is Belfast. This is not Belfast. Better to avoid calling anything a spade in this city. Better to avoid names and places, dates and second names. In this city, names are like points on a map or words worked in ink. They are trying too hard to pass for truth. In this city, truth is a circle from one side and a square from the other. It is possible to go blind staring at the shape of it. Even now, 16 years after the Troubles, it's much safer to stand back and say with conviction, sure, it all looks the same to me. The Troubles are over now. They told us so in the newspapers and on the television. Here, we're very great with religion. We need to believe everything for ourselves. We're all about sticking the finger in and having a good hook around. We didn't believe it in the newspapers or on the television. We did not believe it in our bones. After so many years of sitting one way, our spines had set. We will take centuries to unfold. The Troubles have only just begun. This is hardly true either. It depends upon who you're talking to, how they're standing, and which particular day you've chosen for the chat. Those who are ignorant of our situation can look it up on Wikipedia and find there a 3,000-word overview. Further articles can be read online and in academic journals. Alternatively, a kind of history may be acquired from talking to the locals. Piecing this together will be a painstaking process, similar to forging one jigsaw puzzle from 2 or perhaps 20. The Troubles is too less a word for all of this. It is a word for minor inconveniences such as overdrawn bank accounts, slow punctures, a women's time of the month. It is not a violent word. Surely we have earned ourselves a violent word, something as blunt and brutal as apartheid. Instead, we have a word like scissors, which can only be said in the plural. The Troubles is, was one monster thing. The Troubles is, are many individual evils caught up together. Other similar words include trousers and pliers. The Troubles is always written with a capital T, as if it were an event, as the Battle of Hastings is an event, with a fixed beginning and end, a point on the calendar year. history will no doubt prove it is actually a verb, an action that can be done to people over and over again, like stealing.
Thank you. That's a great beginning. I wonder, did you have to rewrite it to get it to this perfection? It's just an absolutely wonderful way to get into the novel.
Oh, thank you. It's a nightmare to translate. The book's been translated into 12 languages now, and I've been working with the translators trying to pin down because there's so much wordplay in that section.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
it's a nightmare. Poor Germans, they really wrestled with it.
I can imagine. Okay, if we could move to one of the very, central themes of the book, which is the very complicated nature of fatherhood. So we have your quote at the beginning of the book, which is to do with the mythological sirens. And one of the protagonists, Dr. Jonathan Murray, is attracted literally by a modern day version of the old mythological sirens. Then there's Sammy Agnew, who is equally attracted in that same riveting way to violence. And there, the siren becomes the police siren, the fire brigade siren, the ambulance siren, and everything that is violent, and almost as irresistible to Sammy as the call of the siren was to Jonathan. It's unexpected that you have two male protagonists. Being a woman writer yourself, perhaps. I don't know if that also was a considered decision or if it developed in the course of writing the novel. Could you just comment on that a minute? Two male protagonists.
I get asked about this every single interview I do.
I'm sorry then.
No, it's okay. Once I had a man tell me that he was a feminist and that as a feminist he thought I was letting the side down by writing male characters. I think writers should be allowed to write whatever they fancy. And to be very honest, Jonathan, the younger character, is the closest thing to myself that I've ever written. So the fact that he's a man isn't really important. If you look past that, the actual attributes and the experiences that he has are very similar to the way I grew up. I just made him a man because I was particularly interested in the context of Northern Ireland and the Troubles. We have a whole generation of men who have been deeply impacted by the trauma of the Troubles in terms of mental health issues. And one of the big things that comes out with those two men in the novels is they have an inability to speak and express themselves. It's very much a book about language. So Jonathan represents that generation of young people who've been impacted by the legacy of the conflict and are not talking about it. Sammy, I'm also a community arts practitioner, so I've been working in the context of community arts in Northern Ireland for over 20 years. Right. And I work with a lot of older men like Sammy, who are ex-paramilitaries, grew up in these neighbourhoods and have never talked about what they've been through. So Sammy's a very, very closely observed over 20 years combination of about 50 men that I have met who are like him. And I think there are a lot of women in that book as well, and the women are actually the more balanced, strong characters for the most part. So it's shining a lens on two men who are very much symptomatic of the kind of men who have been impacted by the conflict here.
Thank you. Okay, to speak of Irish literature then, I mean, for the last 100 years, the best writing has, of course, in the British Isles has come out of Ireland one way or the other. Most people in the English-speaking world are familiar with the writings of Joyce and Beckett and Yeats, etc. I wanted to ask you a question, which is to do with contemporary literature being written out of Ireland. It seems to me something that requires some thought as to why specifically Northern Irish writers at the moment, poets, playwrights, and novelists are consistently punching above their weight given the size of the population of Northern Ireland. Do you think it has anything at all to do with the socio-geographical context? What is this, this very rich and what exactly is happening in Northern Ireland that is producing such great writing?
First of all, there's always been great writing in Northern Ireland. There's been a legacy of it. We stand on the shoulders of the likes of Seamus Heaney, who's up here behind me, who left
of course.
Great stuff, and C.S. Lewis, who grew up round the corner from where I'm sitting here at the minute. So it's always been there. I think a lot of people haven't realised before it was Northern Irish writing. So we sometimes fall between the stools as Northern Irish artists. So we get forgotten about by the British artists, and we get forgotten about by the Irish art community. And I think the last 20 years in particular have shone a light on Northern Ireland and the artists who are very particularly from here and proud to be from here. So I think there's that. I think there's a momentum that grows when you see your story reflected somewhere else. It gives you the confidence to open your mouth and share your own story. So something like Anna Byrne's Milkman has stirred up a whole generation of writers who can't believe that a story about a place that we know and an experience we know is being so well received around the world. It gives you the confidence to say, well, I'm going to share my story as well. For me particularly, you know, a huge amount of the narratives that you're hearing about Northern Ireland are not Protestant narratives. The predominant kind of focus has been on the nationalist Catholic narrative because, you know, we're the bad guys in this story, and who wants to hear the bad guys side of things? And so it's only been recently that there's been a rise in writers who are exploring that Protestant side of the story, and that's what gave me confidence to start writing about my own community, to see writers like Glenn Patterson and David Park beginning to explore, even David Ireland, the playwright, beginning to explore those themes. So I think we all encourage each other, and it's a tiny wee place. Everybody knows each other. So it is a real community. It's not just writers writing away abstractly by themselves. We're all bumping into each other when we go to get a pint of milk. Wonderful. Or seeing each other in the coffee shops and asking, what are you working on, and sharing ideas. So I think that fosters lots of creativity as well.
Right, that sense of community. Now, before they cut us off, I wanted to get back to the novel for a minute. The most difficult part for me was the sections on the unfortunate children.
Yeah. And
I wonder if you'd be, starting off with answering a question of mine. You may say, no, go and work this out for yourself. You're the reader. But I was wondering if the unfortunate children who vary between, being born with rollerblades on their feet and feathers and, the ability to turn into boats, etc. Does each of the unfortunate children have a separate significance, or should we view them in a cluster and make sense of them?
Both, I think. From the unfortunate children represent the children, the next generation of kids who have been impacted by the legacy of the conflict without having experienced it directly. Right. So we would call them ceasefire babies. They were either born after Good Friday or too young to have known much of the conflict before the peace came. And yet we are seeing these traits coming up in this generation who never saw the conflict themselves, right. But they're struggling with things like, the boy who has got rollerblades for feet and can't stand still is my generation of young people who can't stay in Northern Ireland. They just need to keep going to leave here. There's no sense of being able to stick at something. Each of them, if you start to unpeel them, there is something there. The girl who becomes a boat and has to carry things that are much too heavy for herself. Yes. And that's quite obvious what that's about in terms of the legacy of the conflict. But they were really fun to write as well, because each of those little vignettes stands by itself as a separate story too.
Then let me ask you about Connor. Connor can see the future and doesn't want to. Is there a sense that you have that you can see the future? Do you know what direction things are going in?
I can see what I think
in the country, of course.
Yeah, I can see what I think might happen, and it's scary, and I find it quite difficult to talk about. I think with Brexit looming on the horizon and a lot more conversation happening about a united Ireland, and a lot of those conversations we talked about earlier about what does Protestant identity look like in this place. I don't think we're in for an easy next 10 years here. I think it's going to be quite difficult, and I can understand his sentiment of not wanting, to be able to see the future looming up ahead and not wanting to approach it directly.
Right.
But I mean, saying that, it makes what we do even more important, that the arts becomes a space where we get to have these conversations, we get to interact with each other. Through my community arts work, I've seen so many examples of the two communities coming together to talk and share their experience and foster understanding. And that fear of what might happen in the future should motivate us to be more engaged now, not just in Northern Ireland. I think that's true of wherever you look in the world right now. If you can see what's coming, you need to start acting now to make sure it doesn't get here.
Right. Jan, can I ask about your work in the community? It's largely with older people, from what I understand. And you also have a fascination shown through the postcards, etc., and the illustrations with very young children. So these are the two polar ends of life. Do you see a connection between the two, between the very aged, even those slipping into dementia, and the very young?
Yeah, I don't really like children that much, so I might be fascinated by them. I don't really like them. I love older people. I just really love working with older people. I love, particularly here in Northern Ireland, a lot of them have seen and lived through some really terrible things, and for the most part it shaped them into being more tolerant and more open. So we have a lot of older people that just want everybody to get along and just want everyone to be happy. And I love working with them. I love giving people voice as well. Like, most of my community arts practice is writing. So you're encouraging people to share their story and to understand that their story has meaning and worth and impact. And when you see somebody in their 80s doing that for the first time, it's just it's so heartening and so important. So I've been missing that a lot since lockdown, because obviously it's a lot harder to work with older people at the minute.
But you clearly do have some interest in following how younger children. I mean, this question of asking the younger children to illustrate the stories, I thought was just absolutely fascinating. So, and you say that they get into it and that they really enjoy it. What do you see? I mean, you place the hope in the attitudes of the older people. What do you see in the attitudes of the youngsters you're dealing with, and their illustrations and their writing?
Yeah, I mean, I like those kind of children that are artistic and creative. I just don't have very much patience for the ones that aren't like that. So I did a project there where during lockdown I had children illustrating my stories, and they were all brilliant. If all children were like that, I would be really happy. The ones that get very bored very easily, I'm not as interested.
Okay, so now to your interest in Agatha Christie.
Yeah.
Can you speak about that? That's so, again, such a surprise. Would love to hear you speak about your interest.
Yeah.
What it's based on.
Agatha Christie was my first big literary love. I was 8 whenever I finished. On a Wednesday night, my parents used to go to get the groceries, and they would leave me in the library in Ballymena. And I very quickly read almost everything in the kids section and ended up in crime fiction at the age of 8, which is a bit dangerous. And started reading
Agatha Christie was in the children's section?
Oh, no, I went to crime fiction. I walked across crime fiction.
Yes.
I found Agatha Christie and just devoured them all. And I think it was my first experience. Even though I'm a magic realist, I don't really like fantasy. I'd much prefer realism. And I love the thing that Agatha Christie does where she unsettles us. She's the queen of unsettling her readers. You think you know this cast of characters, and then at the end, Poirot reveals that they're all potentially murderers and could do awful things. And that's actually the baseline of what I do as a magic realist as well. I say, you think you know reality, but actually it could go like this. And so I would say I learned a lot about that from Agatha Christie. And I'm currently, this year, because it's her 100th anniversary, I'm reading all 66 crime fiction novels in a row. I've only got 8 left, so I'm starting to eke them out at this stage.
Okay. And okay, one more question, because I think that hot on our heels, the questions are going to start now. So I wanted to ask you about the postcards. and flash fiction? And do you think the internet has brought us to the point where flash fiction is the fiction of the future?
I think definitely the internet has shaped the short story. So if you look at the short story over the last 25 years, it's reduced in size to meet the demands of online journals. But I think there's also a really healthy interest in short stories of all different lengths and sizes. I did a panel about short stories a few weeks ago, and one thing that emerged from it was just what a flexible genre it is. And the introduction of things like flash and microfiction has allowed it to go all sorts of different ways. So my postcard stories would dabble in the realms of prose poetry. And I love that there's even a crossover now between the short story form and poetry. So that, to me, as an artist, it allows me to be endlessly curious and endlessly experiment with what a short story can do and be. And that's no bad thing.
No, it's absolutely wonderful. I've got questions popping up now, and one of them is asking, I'm not clear about when they talk about obstacles. They want to know what the obstacles in your writing have been. And I'm not sure whether this particular questioner is asking about the lockdown period and whether that has, engendered this, or whether it is, what are the obstacles under previously normal circumstance?
Well, I mean, lockdown is the same as normal for me. Like the big obstacle to my writing career is time. It's always hard to find time. And I think when I left my day job 3 years ago, and I thought I'd just have endless time to write, the actual job of being a writer takes up way more time than actual writing does. And you have to be very careful with that. You'll be asked to do enormous amounts of events and write articles and talk about your work, and there's admin to do and travel, and I constantly have to be mindful that my own writing time isn't getting squeezed to the side. So time is definitely the thing. I would rather have an extra day in the week than an extra £1 million in my bank account every year. That would be more useful to me. I say extra £1 million, there isn't £1 million in there to start with, but you know what I mean.
Yes, absolutely. Tell me, you say that the lockdown hasn't in quite that huge sense impacted your writing. Would you go along with the theories that are being floated these days that, in Shakespeare's time, you had the worst disease of Elizabethan England being the plague, and how it engendered some creativity because of having to think in new ways? Do you think that that's the case?
I think it's different for every person. And I keep saying my mandate at the minute is everyone's having a difficult time, but everyone's having a different version of difficult, and we have to be really graceful and gracious with each other. I live by myself. I get plenty of time to write at the minute because I'm not traveling. So I am getting to write quite a bit, but I'm finding it harder to write. So the anxiety that surrounds COVID is making the actual imagination process a lot harder, but I've got plenty of time at the minute to do it. I know other friends that have small children in the house, and they've got no time anymore because they've children hanging off them. And I know people who struggle with mental health issues, and they haven't even been able to read a book for the last 10 months because the anxiety's been so loud. So I think we just need to be gracious with each other. And some of us will write the best work of our life in this year, and some of us will write nothing. And that's okay.
We have a question here for you from one of the listeners. She's asking, while you were working on this beautiful work, as she puts it, what was more important to you, the character, the plot, or the research? And she's a student of literature who, is asking from that point of view.
Character always with me. So I compare it to giving birth. So I carry my characters for a long time in my head before they're ready to come out. And I do a lot of walking with them. So with Jonathan and Sammy, I walked around the streets of East Belfast for months and months and months in a big parka with my hood up because it was raining all the time, having imaginary conversations with them and getting to know them. And For a lot of writers, the problem where the book feels flat and it's not coming to life is because you've come to it too soon. Your characters, they don't feel fully formed enough. So I always try to give my characters enough time and space to develop. In terms of research, I'm dreadful. I'm so lazy. I'm not interested in research. So I only write what I know, usually. I've got 2 books coming out in the next less than a year, and both are about one's about the area that I grew up in as a child, and one is about the area that we used to go to on holidays, because I'm so lazy at doing research. I know those communities and those worlds, so I'll just write about those.
Okay, that's certainly an honest answer. I would have imagined that it is the characters. You mentioned the rain in Belfast, and the fire starters. It's like an eternal summer. The entire book takes place in a blazing heat of summer, and I found that very unexpected. Yes, yeah, that's right. Then the floods. Absolutely, yes, that's true.
We do, every so often you get like a glorious period like that, and people don't know what to do with it. And there's lots of sections in it where people are out getting sunburnt, and because we're not used to the sun when that happens.
True. Okay, let me read you another question. It says, I've always, they're quoting you as having said, I have always written best in the in-between spaces, airports, boats, trains. Of course, you were a writer in residence on the trains of Ireland, which I find totally amazing, which I hope we can ask you about after this. But this questioner is asking, do you feel that the lockdown has affected the lives of writers in terms of producing words? I'm not sure.
I can talk a wee bit about those liminal spaces as well. So I became a writer whilst I was working full time. I've been writing for 15 years and was working full time in a 40-hour-a-week job and doing my master's at the same time on top of that. And I managed to write my first 2 books in that phase. And it was about learning how to grab every little minute of time that you get. So you're never going to get big, long 3 days in a row to write. What can you do while you're waiting for a train or at the cinema while the trailers are starting? So I would always have a notebook on me and I would do the hard work up here. So I'd be thinking about what I'm going to write. So as soon as I get to the computer, I can maximize the amount of time that I have. And it's probably, as you said, why I write so much, because now I have a bit more time on my hands. I'm still going at that rate of like trying to use every minute that you can get to get stuff down.
Jan, could I ask you to tell us a little bit about what it means to be a writer in residence on the trains of Ireland and in the Royal Victoria Hospital? I mean, these are unusual places. We associate writers in residence with universities.
Yeah, I mean, I also did a residency in a Victorian greenhouse as well. So I kind of specialize in weird spaces. With those kind of residencies, it's not about sitting in a corner quietly just writing for a month or whatever. It's about gathering stories. So with the trains, with the hospital, I would walk around, talk to people, gather up their stories, and then afterwards go and sit somewhere quietly and write them up. And they were wonderful, really rich experiences of meeting people that I wouldn't normally meet. Particularly the trains were brilliant because I traveled just all over the Ireland on trains talking to people, but the hospital was particularly wonderful because I got to meet with healthcare professionals, surgeons, cleaners, patients, visitors, and really kind of capture a little snapshot of what goes on in a hospital behind the scenes. And it was just, I also got to wear a white coat for the week, which was one of my professional career highs. I got stopped,
even closer to Dr. Jonathan in this. We have a question here. Do the cadences of poetry inspire your prose writing?
Yes, that's a great question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the legacy of literature in Northern Ireland, and it's a very poetry-heavy legacy, which I'm very grateful for. I grew up at the early stages of my writing career absolutely surrounded by poets. So every reading you went up to, it was a poetry reading. And from those guys, I learned about rhythm, and I learned about lyricality and even brevity and concision in your writing. So I'm very glad of that. I think I have a kind of poetic sensibility in how I approach prose. I want it to sound nice as well as mean something. And that's definitely something I learned from the poets of Northern Ireland. And if you haven't delved into Northern Irish poetry, you have an absolute treat ahead of you. I'm biased, but I think we've got some of the best poets in the world from here.
Do you write poetry yourself?
Oh no, I'm not good enough, Jayanti. Like that's terrifying to me. There's a whole other level of craft to poetry. It's even those who are breaking the rules have learnt the rules first.
Yes, absolutely.
And I'm deep respect for them, and read a lot of poetry and have many good friends who are poets, but I wouldn't go there myself. I'm not a good enough writer.
Okay, so this is not something that is in the cards for a future book. That you, what do you have in mind for the next thing you're bringing out?
So I've got short story collection coming out in February, which will also be broadcast as 10 programs on Radio 4 on the BBC. So they're actually, the actors are recording that this week, which has been quite fun, getting little updates from there.
Right.
And then I have another novel coming out in July of next year called No Promised Land, which is set in 1993 in a rural village in Northern Ireland.
Right.
And it's about an incident in a primary school there. So that will be out in July. I'm working on at the minute on I don't know how you would say this. It's a documentary about women's community work in Belfast. So I'm working with a team of filmmakers, and I'm providing the kind of script for it. So that's the project I'm working on at the minute. And I'm about to take a wee residency break and just get the head down and start working on the next novel. It's always about 2 years from when you finish a manuscript till you see it in the real world. So we're quite often working quite far ahead of what the readers are seeing coming out in the shelves. It might be 2 books ahead of that kind of thing.
Well, that sounds that you've really got a lot of work in the pipeline. We're out of time now, Jan, though it's been such an exhilarating talk. I would love for it to have continued, but I've got the cue that our talk is over now. So
thank you so much.
I think Sanjoy will probably be addressing us now.
Thank you so much, Jayanti, and thank you, Jan. That was absolutely fascinating. And Jan, your comment about be kind to each other in these difficult times, and of course, find that million pounds. And if you find it, just remember, we love you. A bigger hug, or equally big hug. Send a few quid our way. But seriously, that was absolutely a wonderful conversation. Thank you both. And thank you all for watching. And if you've enjoyed this, remember to log on at 8:30 p.m. for our next session on JLF's Brave New World, which is Serious Men, Sudhir Mishra, in conversation with Vani Tripathi Tikku. Award-winning author Manu Joseph's novel Serious Men has been recently adapted by Sudhir Mishra into a Netflix movie and stars the iconic Nawazuddin Siddiqui. Delves into the life of a man who unwittingly starts a chain of uncontrollable events as he attempts to promote the myth he has created around his son. And that's at 8:30. And a reminder that starting 8th November, we begin with our JLF North America Festival series with JLF Colorado 8th to the 11th and 15th to the 18th of November, followed by JLF Houston from the 21st to the 22nd of November, JLF New York on the 23rd and 24th of November. And of course, we conclude with JLF Toronto 27th to the 29th of November. Please do remember to block your dates and check your details on www.jlflitfest.org. And for those of you who are watching us on YouTube and wish to support Teamwork Arts and continuing our many projects, please do support us by buying the YouTube stickers. It really will go a long way in helping out. Thank you all. See you at 8:30 p.m.